My name's Louise, I'm the Deputy Literary Manager here at the Royal Court, and I'm here just to have a conversation with Cordelia Lynn, who wrote Lela Co, which most of you probably saw tonight. I can't really see you out there, but I assume you're all there. There you are. So we'll probably do about 15 minutes of just chat around some questions we have, and then I'll go out to some questions from you guys as well. So
Right.
it's quite exciting. So Cordelia and I were chatting earlier about the play, and there were some things that I really wanted to ask her about. I guess one of those was about, obviously it's a very, well for me anyway, it's a very emotionally affecting play, and it's about a lot of things that are obviously quite real, quite occurring in the world right now. And one of the things I wanted to ask about was how as a writer you get into the place where you can create an experience which sort of contains sort of empathy for experiences that might be quite far beyond your own ones, and about what your process for getting into quite a different space from perhaps your own life experience might have been.
Yeah, so that's sort of quite a funny thing really, because I think, and I don't really know how all writers experience this, and I imagine everyone sort of does things differently, but I think when you're, at least when I'm writing things, you're at once sort of completely involved in the thing that you're creating, and you experience it every day, all the time, which with this play was not necessarily always a great experience. Although sometimes it was, because, the character Lela is a very lovely character, and she was really sort of great to hang out with, so I sort of quite liked that. But you do sort of really know what you're doing within the boundaries of what it is you're creating. But then obviously, there are things that happen in this play where I have absolutely no idea, so it's a sort of quite weird, conflicted experience. And I think it always comes down, well not always, but I think it, particularly with a play like this, it would come down to two things, which would be research, and I sort of quite enjoy researching because it makes me feel safe, because I studied literature and things like that, so it's sort of quite nice researching, because it's like I'm writing an essay and I'm researching, and I don't have to think about the writing side of it yet, but then you sort of get to the writing side of it, and then that's imagination, and what you can do with your imagination. And so these sort of two things kind of come together, and that's when you're really perhaps creating, is when those two things are working. It's certainly with a play like this, where obviously there were things to look into, like sex trafficking and conflict and the experience of people in conflict, and then you sort of just put all that aside and go.
So did you feel like, did that weigh quite heavily on you, like the responsibility of representing other people's experience, or were you able to sort of get to a point where you're like, okay, I can keep that in one place and go on to write my play in another place?
I think both. I mean, I think you do feel quite responsible, but I think you would feel responsible for every play that you wrote, because you would want it to be true in some way, or real in some way. And if I chose to write a play about people going shopping, which I probably wouldn't do, but I might do, I sort of feel responsible to that as well. Not saying that going shopping isn't necessarily a very dramatic thing, it might be a very dramatic thing, but you would always feel a responsibility to what you're working with, and that's sort of like a side of it, because obviously there's more in this than a lot of things in terms of feeling responsible for it. And what I felt mostly with this particular play, when I knew what I was going to be doing, and I knew instinctively certain things to do with form and how I was going to write it, and that was all very clear to me, but the thing I felt most powerfully was that I didn't want it to be voyeuristic or gratuitous, and I hope it isn't that, and I think that Jude Christian, who directed it, felt that immediately with the script as well, and has produced a production which literally puts you in blackout, so that there's no voyeurism. But when I was writing it from the very beginning, I was really keen for that not to happen. And that was a great deal to do with responsibility, because I think there's a very fine line between saying, well, you know, terrible things happen to people in the world, and then sort of doing terrible things to people on stage. And again, I'm not saying that that's not something you can ever not do, because sometimes it's very important to do that. But with this play particularly, when I was working on it, immediately actually before I was working on it, I just felt, you know, I don't want to show certain things because I don't feel that it's my place to do that. And that was a huge responsibility for me, and that's why I wrote it the way I wrote it.
Mm. So when we were talking earlier, you were talking a little bit about that, picking a form that gave you the opportunity to say tell the story that you want to tell through the form as much as through the words. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you found the form for this play and why you felt it had to be told in this particular way.
So, you know, form's like this really funny thing, and I'd heard this phrase once upon a time, which is sort of like form reflecting content, and I was like, God, yeah, that sounds really good. So I kind of chucked it into a load of essays and sort of went like, yeah, form reflecting content. And then when I was sort of, it made me feel really clever. I was like, yeah, form. And then when I was first told a particular story, which was one of the points of inspiration for this play, the thing that happened to me most immediately was going, oh right, well this play has to be a monologue, and there's no question of that it absolutely has to be a monologue, because someone who is trying to tell a story can't tell their story. And when I went on to research it, I realised that this isn't an uncommon thing, and I'm assuming everyone in the room just watched the play, but you know, there is sort of the nature of these experiences of these people is that they often are shamed into silence, or for their own safety cannot talk about things that have happened to them. So that sort of all made sense in terms of this monologue form that I had instinctively felt, and I thought, oh yes, that's good. That's how it has to be. But then equally instantly it became clear to me that it couldn't be a pure monologue with just a person, or in this case a woman, on, well, I suppose it would depend how you want to produce it. You could do it with a man, I think that would be quite interesting. But in this particular production, a woman on stage sort of telling her story, I knew that it couldn't work like that, because the whole nature of this world that we live in and what it does to these people, either actively or passively, is that it's constantly undermining them and not allowing them to speak. And so it had to be this, I mean, I call it a monologue, but it's definitely an interrupted monologue, and at some points it becomes a shared monologue, and you know, she has to reclaim this monologue. And it was weird, because it was only sort of when I had that instinct with this play that I sort of thought, oh, that's what it means, form reflecting content, like I've totally got that now. And I think that's really important. And I thought about plays that I wrote before and plays that I might write in the future. And I think, you know, if you're lucky, you might find the right form for your play, for your content, you know, your poem or whatever it is you might be doing. And if you find your form to tell your content, your story, then you're probably onto something, and something might actually work. So it was lovely with this, how it came so sort of, it was just clear, it was like a song, it was so obvious, and it was nice.
Did you just wake up and you went, this is how I need to
No, I didn't, no, I was actually wide awake, and I was sitting there, I was awake, which is unusual for me, and it was when I was speaking to 1989 Productions who first sort of brought a particular story to my attention, and I was just in the cafe and they were talking, and I was meanwhile going, oh yeah, so it's not to be a monologue, but it can't be a monologue, blah blah blah, and they were sort of still talking, and it was like this, which was quite a nice experience, because it's not always like that. Yeah.
So this is the second play that you've had produced, is that right?
Sort of third, like I had some funny things on when I was at university, which were really sort of charming, but third, like let's call it third.
Okay, it's your third production. So how has the process been of having a play on here, and the sort of, obviously having a play on the Royal Court seems to bring with it quite a lot of exposure in different ways. How's that experience been for you?
But it's sort of actually been quite funny, because you know, we sort of sit in these production meetings, and I think, you know, for Jude as well, this is sort of like, you know, a big experience for her too. And I gather from Vicky it's quite unusual, because, you know, both myself, the writer, and Jude, the director, have never had anything. We've never worked at the court before, and normally either the director or the writer would have. So, you know, this is really exciting. And we sort of sit in these production meetings, and, you know, you can kind of get anything in a way. And, you know, you sort of sit there and go, can we have a candy floss machine? And they'd be like, yeah, great, candy floss machine's done. You know, like, oh, David, seriously, like, David's got to do a magic trick where he pulls the lollipop out of her ear, and Jude's like, could we get a magician in? Yeah, magician, brilliant, got a magician. It was really fantastic. So, you know, that side of it was really exciting because you just sort of felt that you were running around and there was all this, you know, this whole world at your disposal and people really wanting to help you and nurture this thing that you were trying to create, whatever this is that we try to create. So that was sort of very exciting. Actually watching a play that you write on this level is quite a funny experience because I think previously things have always been, for me at least, slightly more amateur, and you're just totally aware the entire time that, you know, this is the play that I wrote and here it is, and oh, those are my friends who are acting in it and blah, blah, blah. And there sort of came a funny moment with this, not in the first preview or the second preview even, but somewhere along the line when I was watching it where I just felt completely disconnected from it. Not in a bad way at all, but just, you know, I was watching this thing and going, oh, that's quite cool, look at the people doing the things. And it felt very far away. And maybe that's something that's particular to having something done to this standard that you would do here. I don't know.
Yeah, because I find that really interesting. Cordelia said that, you know, sort of feeling sort of a step of remove from the play then once it is in production. Is that something that happened to you before then, or was that always sort of slightly mitigated by the fact that maybe you knew the people performing? Or?
I think maybe slightly mitigated. And I think it's a longer process as well, because, you know, months ago this whole process started, and, you know, and I talked to Vicky and Chris, and, you know, then I talked to Jude, and Jude's amazing, and that's wonderful, and then we're auditioning, and then, you know, lighting and sound come in, and then, you know, you have a design, and it goes on, and then you go into rehearsal, and then you sort of got a month of rehearsal, and then you go into, and it's sort of, it's a very long process. And that's weird, because when you go to the theatre, and I go to the theatre a lot because I like going to the theatre, and for me that process, unless I go and see something twice, you know, you sit down and you're like, oh great, you know, an hour and a half later, good, done. But actually sort of so much has happened, and it kind of becomes quite blurry and quite strange. And people talk a lot about, you know, people keep saying to me after every performance, or, you know, whenever I see my friends or whatever, they sort of say, oh, it's like your babies in the world, and, you know, like, you know, how do you feel about that? Or like, you know, it must be really hard when you've written a play and it's like your baby and people are sort of, you know, creating it. And I don't know, I'm not really sure how that metaphor works. I sort of feel in a way that plays are perhaps much more kind of like lovers, because actually they're a bit shit sometimes, and, you know, you sort of like argue with them quite a lot, or try and make them and try and work with them, and then you sort of make compromises and come to some kind of conclusion, and then a load of other people come along and sort of like fuck with your lover, and you're like, whoa, okay, not sure how I feel about that, in front of an audience, and, you know, it gets really weird, and then you're like, well, actually maybe that's the best thing for my lover, is to be fucked by other people, and sort of let them go, and that's when you get to this stage, when you sort of see it again, like I was seeing it tonight, and it's very strange because you go, oh, I recognize you, but I don't necessarily know you anymore. And that's quite a powerful feeling, and it's got a kind of sadness to it. But, you know, then another play comes along and you're sort of like, hello. What's a nice play like you doing in a place like this?
On that ambiguous note, we're going to questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for Cordelia?
Well, I'd like to ask about one particular element of the play, which was the darkness scene, where I think maybe fits with your not wanting voyeurism, but I did find it extremely powerful because you hear very clearly and you imagine yourself what's happening. Did that develop when you were writing the play, or did you think of doing that scene like that, or has that something that's come about during?
So that's really interesting. That's absolutely Jude Christian's idea, and unusually for me, this text that I've written has, you have it, you will perhaps read it, and you will see that it has very few stage directions in it at all. And that's quite strange to me. I don't usually do that. It's sort of quite controlling. But I just sort of thought, well, that was again how it had to be done. And so there's nowhere in my text that says, things have to go into blackout. But that's sort of what I was referring to earlier when I said, I felt Jude read the script and absolutely got a certain thing in it where it was just like, there's certain things that can't be seen here because they can't necessarily be understood. And the darkness, it is, like, I agree with you, it's amazing. When I first went to the first dress rehearsal and I experienced it, I just thought, God, because it's this weird thing of, it's so claustrophobic and it's so terrifying, and it sort of heightens that, but at the same time, it's almost a relief. And you feel that it's right. You feel, no, I shouldn't be seeing this, and that's why we're in the dark here, where sort of she's in the dark. And I suppose it's in the nature of things getting smaller and smaller and smaller in her world. But that was very much, Jude being a genius, so I take no credit for that.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah, very well, very well. Well, I'm interested in the set design. I don't know how many plays you've seen up here, probably a lot, because you were in the Young Writers Program at one point. So we're actually on an angle in here, and whose idea was that? And it's just a really interesting, unique set.
Yeah, no, so you're absolutely right. Like, for people who this is their first time coming into this theatre, Jerwood upstairs, it's the most amazing space because it's completely versatile. And I think I've seen about 10 to 15 plays in here, and every time you come in, it's completely sort of, you can do anything with it. It's really extraordinary. And so with this particular one, again, that was Jude and the designer Anna, trying to work out. And again, it's difficult. The text has no directions in it, so it's, what are you doing? You're going to put it in a round, or are you going to have it completely end on? Sort of like proscenium art style thing. And what is the best way of producing this story to sort of show it to its abilities, but at the same time, again, not do this voyeuristic, gratuitous thing. There's something very voyeuristic about an audience looking at the stage. And I think they felt, well, when I spoke to them about it, they had felt there was something very powerful about this diagonal, like you say, going into the corner, and it really sort of pushes you into it and like pulls you in. And I think there's something about this play, well, I wrote it, so I should tell you that I know that there's something about this play which is trying to tell you and me writing it that you are to some degree complicit in what you see, you are implicated in it to a greater or lesser degree. And I think this idea was very sort of strongly related to that, that you'll with her. Yeah.
Very effective.
And you had a question?
Yeah, when you started researching the issue of trafficking and conflict, did you ever feel like incredibly overwhelmed by the suffering that women go through? And if you did, how did you carry on writing, and how did you keep doing what you needed to do to tell the story?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I think it's actually quite a horrifying question for, maybe most writers to talk about, because the funny thing is, or certainly with me, maybe I'm just a horrifying person and every other writer would disagree, but actually when you're sort of really, you don't become overwhelmed by what you're doing because you're so in what you're doing and you're already there and you're sort of hanging out with these people. And it's certainly the research process, there were moments where I was sort of going, oh God, no, surely not, a lot, and that happened a lot. But the moment I had Lela's voice, and I was able to start writing properly, it just, I was with her and it's language that you're going through and it takes you forward. Maybe it doesn't, it did with me. I never at any point felt overwhelmed by what I was doing. I feel more overwhelmed sort of on a daily basis, opening my laptop and kind of like looking at the news and going, oh God, again, closing my laptop again. And actually when you're writing, there's a kind of security in it, I suppose, because you know where you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it. I hope.
question. Anyone up there? You're right up at the back. We'll come back to you.
So when writing a play like this, what's your, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to make something which is entertaining or something which is just raises awareness, or are you trying to affect a kind of practical change in the world? And if so, how do you see that happening as a result of what you're doing here?
Yeah, I don't ultimately have, and again, all writers are different. I don't have any, as far as I know, particular aim in mind when I'm working on a play, which I appreciate might be sort of slightly kind of aesthete-y and, you know, maybe not politically serious. With this play, it was like I was told a story and I thought I know how I could make that happen in a particular way. And once I know that, I don't really have any other choice but to do that thing because I'm interested in it. What I hope would happen with this play is that, and again, particularly this production, because I think it's been done so intelligently and you haven't walked out of the corridor yet, we were about to walk out of the corridor that you walked in through and it might feel different to you. I hope you would go into the world and go, oh, I sort of thought I knew what I was seeing, and actually perhaps I don't know what I'm seeing, because, you know, like in the play she says we have a very human way of not seeing and not even hearing the telemarks, and I think there was certainly an element of that with this play. I wanted to lead you into a false sense of security, and I wanted you to know that things can be really quite awful, but I also wanted to write something that was very beautiful, and I think that's very important, even though perhaps not all people would say that that's important. I would say it is. I'm not sure I want you to feel any sense of catharsis, because I think that's too easy. If everyone sort of cries and goes, oh, I saw this awful thing and then I cried and then I felt better about it because I cried, I don't think that it's that easy in this world, particularly with these stories. So perhaps I was sort of vaguely trying to do all of those things, maybe not necessarily achieving any of them, but we can start with that. That's quite good. I'll think about that a bit longer. I'll be prepared next time.
Well, I said we had one more question, but I was an unreliable narrator. We're going to have one last one before we do it again.
We're talking about your research. Did you research into the psychology of abuse and abused people? Because I was very taken with the way that Lela had really taken on the view of herself as an abuser would have seen her, the abuse takes on, which I think is often a psychological understanding of why the abused person, in a sense, not exactly accepts it, but there's a form of denial going on.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had gone into the psychology of abuse and abuser and abused.
I think a lot of the reading that I've done in my life has given me some insight into those things, not just, you know, books or plays that I've read or films that I've watched, or, you know, any sort of perhaps fictional thing, but also reading articles and essays and blogs or whatever, you know, areas that interest me. I would have had some insight into that for this particular play. And again, not a personal insight, but very much a studied insight. I think with this particular play, the research I did involved reading quite a few testimonies of people who've been trafficked. The nature of how they speak gives you some insight into that, how they talk about their experiences. And there's a famous Amnesty report about sex trafficking, where the sort of headline of it is, you mean I have rights? Which is sort of, this person not even recognising that they have rights. There you go, well, that's interesting. But again, well, it's not interesting, it's horrifying, but, you know, just like little things like that I think are quite significant for when you then let the imagination do what it does. And actually her character, and you were talking about how she experienced her, Lela experienced her abuse and sort of talks about it. that was how Lela did it, and if I had found another character, then they might have done it slightly differently. I think that was very much in her nature, and I came to know her very, very well because she was a very giving character when I was working with her. She was lovely. And I think that that's quite a lot to do with her because she wants you to feel okay. She tries very, very hard to make you feel okay. Another character might have done it slightly differently, and I think part of her making you feel okay is to try and cause as few problems as possible with this figure that she's working with. I mean, I just ad-libbed that on the spot, but like I think it's true. I think it was a lot to do with the nature of this character. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, that's about all we've got time for tonight. There will be, I think, at some point 2 podcasts, which is me again having a conversation with Cordelia, as if you haven't heard enough, and also
We
with
talk about the patriarchy, yes, right?
That's great. And also the director, Jude Christian, so you can look out for those. But in the meantime, thanks very much for staying, and thanks to Cordelia for having this conversation. Thank you.